According to its website, Hylix is a recreational program with light JRPG elements. Beyond that, it's a claymation game made using RPG Maker with some pixel art thrown in, all created by Mason Lindroth. Featuring randomly generated text that's an intentionally misleading red herring, the game's story is instead told through its environmental design. Suffice to say, the story isn't too complicated, the TLDR having the main character, Wayne, a crescent moon-shaped fellow, traveling across the land, gathering his mates to go clap a moon-headed bloke named Gibby's cheeks. So it's your standard RPG affair. From the get-go, the claymation combined with the odd perspective and designs give Hylix a very surreal look. Most people you encounter look like the cover of Incesticide, being some weird object-headed people with legs more often than not. Plus, the outline of walls are all strange shapes rather than being solid lumps to form walls like you would expect out of something like the Netherhood, which only further adds to its strange style. Then there's the way that everything crumples up or is utterly destroyed when you interact with it, adding to the whole theme of creating and deconstructing stuff. It's also worth mentioning the music is equally strange, sounding like something out of a Mars Volta album. It's a bit hard to pin down with how varied and inconsistent it can be, depending on where you are, making the whole situation that much weirder. Sadly, there's no sound option, so you may have to mess with your system settings to hear it better in-game. Either way, the music, plus the random gibberish NPCs spout at you, in addition to even the names of places being randomized, makes the whole experience an intentionally bewildering mess in the best way possible. As you run around with your janky-ass 2 frames of animation, you'll be regularly accosted by Randy J's looking to impede your progress. Provided you are unable to avoid their simple homing AI, it'll promptly shift perspective into a first-person turn-based RPG for combat. In the world of Hylix, you commit murder by way of gestures, with you snapping your fingers as a standard attack. I have to say, this is a top contender for one of the coolest attack moves I've seen in an RPG. It's so simple, but there's something about it that's just really satisfying. Then there's special gestures, which are essentially spells that use will to cast. You start off with 1 integral to each character you pick up, and can learn more of these by interacting with TVs you find scattered throughout the world. They allow you to do all sorts of things, from healing and protecting yourself, to putting enemies to sleep, to causing huge damage. In any case, you'll be treated to some pretty awesome animations as you perform all of these as well as use items, such as growing a cactus whenever you use a vegetable healing item, or a warm burrito to revive fallen allies. Using the dynamite also has to be one of my favorites. The animations were genuinely so entertaining that I went out of my way to fight anything and everything I could. And enemies don't respawn after they explode into gory bits, however, so enjoy it while it lasts. And for your endeavors, you'll be rewarded with items, bucks, and flesh to spend on gaining better equipment to replace that roll of toilet paper you duct tape to yourself. The combat as a whole is enjoyable, having a very Persona or Shin Megami Tensei vibe to it from how methodical it can be, which is to say that you and enemies both can dish out some pretty big numbers to make you clench your cheeks. It can be pretty difficult early on when you're lacking party members and equipment, especially since there's no traditional leveling method. And my only gripe about the turn-based combat system is that you have to tell all of your party members to do things, then it has them act out according to their initiative. So it limits your options a bit by being unable to recover a teammate's will using a juice box in order to cast a spell in the same turn, unfortunately. Besides this though, the fighting is pretty fun and takes part in some really strange abstract areas. Or straight up in some parking lot for some reason? What? It's also worth mentioning that new party members don't know techniques you've already learned from previously visited TVs, so you'll find yourself having to backtrack to fix that, which can understandably get a bit annoying. The enemy design is about as bizarre as everything else in Hylix, most being humanoid figures with something replacing their upper bodies, or being some weird-ass abomination entirely. Yeah, I'd say that's a hard projection, alright. Then there's the even stranger stuff, like leg heads that remind me of the mannequins from Silent Hill, or ghosts that look like a melted Michelin Man. They each have their own unique traits and methods of attack, whether it's blinding your whole party, making you unable to hit a damn thing, or guards spamming Dark Flame to deal huge damage to your entire party. As said, the early game can be a bit difficult without liberal use of items and special gestures, and even the RNG nature of the combat can be rather harsh at times. Since enemies don't need will to use special abilities, they can freely spam some really strong attacks that wipe your entire party. You can manage it with some proper planning and execution of CC gestures, like Wayne's hypnosis though. Plus, having some better equipment and gaining more maximum health, or flesh as it's called here, helps out a lot later on. Some of the boss fights can be a bit drawn out though, given that they can deal large amounts of damage or afflict your party with status effects that you need to take care of quickly. Then they'll regularly heal themselves for a huge chunk of health, forcing you to whittle them down all over again, ultimately resulting in battles of attrition in some cases. Sooner or later, you'll be banished to the Shadow Realm, where upon death, you'll be treated to an animation of Wayne's flesh melting off of his face, which looks pretty sick. However, rather than punishing you for dying by having you restart from a saved game, Hylix instead has you visit the afterlife. Given that there's no leveling system, it's actually beneficial to perish now and then, since this is the only place you can go to raise your maximum health by using the grinder to turn all that meat you've been collecting into flesh points. While you're here, you can also visit the executive suite and make some sandcastles on the beach while you're at it, not to mention fast travel to any checkpoints you've unlocked by way of these giant floating crystals. As a result, dying becomes an integral part of the game in order to increase your future survivability. Although with that said, this ties in with the backtracking you already need to do in order to learn techniques you've previously picked up, so it can get a little tedious if you want to go out of your way to level up, as it were. At least the hallway of killer statues is very literal, so you always have some means of going back there, even if it isn't exactly the most convenient. Outside of fighting, for the most part, you'll be traveling around in the isometric overworld map, which does a decent job at nudging you in the right direction of where to go. Given the random nature of 99% of the text, you're pretty much relying on the map design to figure out what you're meant to be doing. And exploration is often rewarded with items or even party members as you go around the different islands by land, boat, and airship. I'm not sure I want to know why there's a warm burrito in the toilet. Hey, you find a stick of dynamite. Hell yeah, you take it. Besides the narrator having some good funny lines now and then, there isn't much in the way of characterization when it comes to your teammates. They're pretty much mute outside of their initial quests that they task you with before joining you in your violent endeavors. Like Pangormer challenging you to a 1v1 you won't, only for him to say psych as he summons two buddies from nowhere, the cheapo. Yeah, okay guy. In any case, all of the locations are about as abstract as the rest of Hylix. Whether that's having some tentacles give you the hentai treatment, so you can visit some dream world in order to find the location of a buried artifact, otherwise known as a paper cup, or running around on giant statue versions of Wayne while getting chased by horrible monsters, not to mention a chill place to rock out with some optional Randy J music section. Hell yeah. Really, the only major downsides are the randomly generated text making it a bit difficult to figure out what's going on or what you're meant to be doing for a good portion of the game, which can be a little frustrating. Plus, the combat goes from being fairly difficult to pretty easy towards the tail end of the game, especially if you went out of your way to wipe out every enemy on the map, then doubly so if you manage to track down all of the sage tokens required to unlock the strongest gesture in the game that can let you easily defeat the final boss within a few turns. Some of the gestures you get can feel a bit overtuned as well, allowing you to clear out encounters with repeated use of dark flame AoEs, then topping up your will using juice boxes between battles, which is super sustainable given how dead cheap they are to buy, so as a result the combat's difficulty feels a little unrefined, erring a little heavily on being too easy or too difficult at times. However, it's not a deal breaker, and it's still entirely enjoyable and engrossing, especially with the visceral gestures of each ability in combat. Hylics 1 is a short but entertaining and weird experience, taking only about 2 to 3 hours to complete, and it's very well worth of its asking price of only a few quid. While it may leave you scratching your head at times with how bizarre it is, it's definitely a worthwhile experience, and it'll also give a good idea of what to expect before diving into its sequel. Speaking of which, it's about time we moved on to the sequel. Hylics 2 picks up some time after the first game, having Wayne be informed that Gibby's minions are trying to resurrect their master, and being tasked to put a stop to that sort of thing. So it's basically The Legend of Zelda 2. It also turns out that Wayne is an entire species now, including some kind of weird larvae form, and you're now given your quest from Old Wayne, who may or may not be the protagonist from the last game. It's never really made clear, but what I do want to know is why all of these wains only have one bed. Anyway, it follows much the formula of the previous Hylix title while making some substantial changes in places. For starters, it's a 3D platformer made in Unity now. Initially, I found it a little jarring going from the original 2D RPG exploration style to this new platforming one, but I did eventually grow accustomed to it. Admittedly, it does allow for more creative level design and solutions to puzzles while having plentiful secrets to discover. I do have to say though that I was unsure whether I was doing what was actually intended or cheesing the game half the time from how jank navigating some of the terrain felt. Even with the little circle indicator below Wayne, it can still be a bit finicky at times finessing jumps and landings. The Claymation environments can also be a little tricky to navigate, making it hard to figure out what you can and can't jump onto. Although it does feel a little better after some time to adjust, it never truly feels great. Another new addition being the slap. Having restricted the use of items and gestures solely to fights, you're now reliant on bullying these little bugs to regain flesh and will between encounters. If you time it right, you can also slap enemies as they're about to engage in combat, giving you a small boost to your will for the first turn, which I completely forgot about on my first playthrough. Oops. This is a pretty good skill to pick up in practice, however, as the amount of will you have to start off with is substantially lower than its predecessor. Oftentimes having you only able to cast 1 or 2 gestures regularly, so getting an extra 20 will for free for the first turn is a pretty huge boon. You can also roll and dash through enemies to try and avoid encounters provided you time it right, otherwise risk just falling face first into them. So there's some risk reward to it, which is pretty nice. Plus you also get the air dash very early in the game, which is both essential for getting around as well as just being a lot of fun to use. I found myself using it near enough constantly. The afterlife is no longer strictly a die-to-enter area, instead having you sink into these juice fountains to travel there as well as the old-fashioned way. Oh, and it appears like they solved their inflation problem, as you'll no longer be carrying around multiple hundreds of thousands of bugs. Instead, everyone's moved on to using bones now, and you can go running around collecting them as is common practice for a platformer. The presentation as a whole is a lot nicer to look at, being upscaled at a higher resolution, and having a lot more animation frames for both the main characters as well as enemies now. It's a really nice improvement coming from Hylics 1, where you're fighting static claymation statues, to seeing them now move in a very surreal stop-motion way. It breathes a whole new life into the encounters, which is only further improved by the new line of gesture animations too. Watching each hand movement for casting spells feels really satisfying as you shock enemies with Pangorma's lightning, or have Dedismone heal and protect your teammates by covering them in shaving foam, which can only make sense in a Hylix game. The enemies get their own unique attack animations now too, being equally entertaining to watch and making the battles even more fun than the first Hylix. The same cast from before make a return, with Pangorma getting a noticeable facelift. He's looking a lot better than he did last time around. In any case, each party member still has their own gesture intrinsic to them, with Dedismone serving as the white mage with his foam armor, and Pangorma with his lightning attack for those clutch high damage moments. I'm glad to say that newly recruited party members join you with all the gestures you've learned so far, cause I would have hated of having to backtrack to some obscurely hidden TV I came across hours ago. This is such a nice quality of life change. They also get a fair bit more characterization this time around, which is nice to see, without them going into lengthy dialogues through cutscenes amongst themselves or the like. And it's quite a while before you get some Snoza, but it feels so rewarding once you do, since she has one of the very few attacks that can hit multiple targets. Not to mention the adjustments made to the combat itself, with nearly every encounter feeling pretty lethal and requiring proper planning to execute. Which thankfully now benefits from taking turns as they come up, rather than planning out all of your actions at once, then waiting to see how they get screwed up like in the original Hylix. This means you can actually use a juice box to refill a party member's will and have them use a gesture on the same turn, rather than having to wait until a later time like the previous game. Which is such a small change, but it makes a huge difference. There's an even wider variety of enemies this time around, and they look substantially different from one another, not just being mainly humanoid-shaped object heads. They each come with their own traits and roles that make them unique and dangerous threats in their own right, creating priority targets like poolmen that'll split and multiply themselves if you don't either set them on fire or take them out quickly. Then there's these little goofy looking goobers that'll ring up their mates to come help them out. Encounters can sometimes be full of several high priority targets though, which can make it a little overwhelming at times. But given how non-punishing dying is, I guess Lindroth felt he could get away with it. Plus, you are able to change the game's difficulty at any time through the menu, so there is that option if it becomes a bit too much. I think Hylics 2 still suffers from being fairly easy once you're substantially geared up and have a high flesh total though, as there will be few things left to challenge you after a while. Although that then leads to fights during the endgame feeling very drawn out, having both sides being super beefy, while the enemy has access to multiple full healing AoEs that just turns into a DPS race. Even if you went out of your way to unlock the strongest gesture attack to deal with them, it can still feel a bit of a slog. Overall, the combat is very enjoyable though, with a lot of memorable enemies and some side content and bosses that were fun to uncover. I'm glad to say that the improvements carry over to the music too. While the first Hylix had a very strange soundtrack in its own right, bringing on board a proper composer to help out really did a lot to elevate its musical status. Despite having a noticeably different sound compared to the first Hylix, it still comes across as something that fits in perfectly with this strange, surreal setting. There's several earworms that got stuck in my head for weeks after playing it, like the final boss and regular fighting themes. You'd expect the main battle music for a JRPG to be super energetic and try to invoke a lot of hype, whereas here it's laid back and pretty chill, when you know you have all the time you need to decide on what to do next. It also feels like the gang is moonwalking during battle, as the enemies are constantly approaching you in first person, and their corpses slide away into the background after you turn them into chicken nuggets. The music during exploration is also memorable and went a long way with alleviating my frustrations even when I was stuck trying to figure out where to go next during the extended platforming sections. Hylics 2 also shakes things up now and then with tonal shifts, as it features a 2D side-scrolling platformer featuring Chibi Wayne. For a brief side thing to disable some force field, it's actually pretty good. The controls are responsive enough, the little clay people you fight are cute, and the music is another standout banger. Getting to fly around inside your airship is also a great experience, as it allows you to explore this clay world in proper 3D, rather than the isometric overworld map when running around on foot. It's probably the lighting, but the aesthetics here remind me a little of Risk of Rain 2, which is by no means a bad thing. There's also the side part where I got lost for over 90 minutes in a first-person dungeon crawler that had me bumping my face up against every single tile looking for secrets like it was Duke Nukem 3D.
Where is it?
While traversing this literal maze was borderline AIDS, it was at least somewhat tolerable due to the heaps of hidden items it had to find. As well as a completely random side boss that caught me off guard by how absurd it was. All of this in addition to the inclusion of a proper story makes for a really fun and memorable JRPG unlike any others I've tried. Being improved in just about every way possible, including higher resolution and clearer graphics that make it a beautiful, surreal mess to witness. Hylics 2 oozes style, and I would definitely be thinking about this game for a while to come. Even managed to answer the questions I had left over from the first game, like explaining away what the deal was with the random gibberish text in the original Hylix. Outside of how long-winded the fights can become towards the tail end of the game, and the platforming being a little finicky at times, I'm hard-pressed to think of many complaints at all. Being postponed from its initial release date by 2 years, all that time and effort really shows. It's about 4 times longer than its predecessor, and I'll be interested to see what Mason Lindroth has to offer in the future, as he's left me with quite the impression with Hylix. You don't need to play the first one to enjoy this either, so if you have an inkling towards Claymation or JRPGs in general, then I can absolutely recommend playing this one. It's really something.